It's a great pleasure to be here. I really enjoy it, and I went to the Mass that was celebrated here yesterday, and although I didn't understand what was being said, the mood was very positive, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me first talk briefly about the papal encyclical, and in particular the pieces of it. It's a very long, relatively long document with many thoughts in it. Let me focus on a few of them, few important ones pertaining to climate change in particular, which is my area of expertise. Pope Francis talks about climate as a common good, and looking at that as an economist, that means that climate is a global public good, something that is provided for all the public to use, and it's the responsibility of all the public to provide it. It's endangered by greenhouse gases. Warming threatens ecosystems and sea level. The poor, and this is a continuous theme, the poor are particularly affected by climate change. Those who cause the problem seem indifferent or worse, and technocratic paradigm is prominent. Now, I should say that these slides are in English, and if anyone would like a copy of them, just provide me with your email, and I'm happy to send it to you. It may be easier to read the slides than to follow all of the additional words that I'm adding in. Some solutions, and this is all according to the Pope, are that the poor end up carrying too much of the burden, and there's a need for common but differentiated responsibilities, and enforceable international agreements are needed, and that markets for carbon are a ploy for maintaining excessive consumption. So for any economist in the audience, they'll recognize that that last bullet point will raise the eyebrows of most economists. It's not how most of us view markets for carbon. So let me now talk about the UN's view of this issue, of these same issues in parallel to what the Pope wrote about. There are many common threads between the UN analysis, which was done by the IPCC, which many of you have heard of the IPCC. It won the Nobel Prize in 2007. And the IPCC means the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in the last assessment, they focused on ethics and economics as one chapter of their analysis, viewing ethics as an important part of solving the climate problem as well as economics. So that goes very much along the lines of the papal encyclical, viewing ethics, economics, and technology as pivotal. So ethics tells us some things, but not others. Ethics, and this includes the Pope's view, provides a lens to perceive how diverse people perceive what is right and wrong, just and unjust. It provides few absolute findings of what is just or right. Many ethical prescriptions are not facts, they're opinions. Many well-argued opinions, but ethical findings boil down to opinions that many people hold, but they don't have the same strength as a fact, such as if I drop this on the ground, we know it will go down. That's a fact. Economics is a tool not for ethical decisions, but for making policy decisions. And the questions we asked in IPCC is, how can theories of value be used to rank policies, climate policies? What practical methods are there for evaluating climate policies? and the consequences of climate change, and normative economic tools, such as cost-benefit analysis. It's important to remember that they rest on ethical principles, and a cost-benefit analysis is not an absolute pronouncement of what is right or wrong, but is conditional on ethical principles. And I'll just quickly go over this. This is just a list of people that contributed to the work I'm going to talk about here. I was the leader of it, and these other people played a very important role, including, I'm told, a Chilean, Luis Mundaca, on the left-hand side at the bottom, who's labeled as from Sweden, but he is Chilean. Okay, so I'm going to show you 6 slides only. I say that so you won't think I'm going on forever about the results of the IPCC. And these are sort of factoids that are really important to remember. And the first, and you can go through this graph and look at the information, but the main point is that 55%, over half, of the CO2 emissions ever emitted have come after 1970. So this is very much a modern problem, if you consider 1970 in the recent past. Secondly, far more carbon is in the ground that will be emitted over the rest of this century. So some people are saying, well, maybe we should just wait out this problem. It will eventually go away like many problems. We'll run out of carbon and the problem will disappear because carbon will be in short supply. But keeping in mind that there's far more in the ground than we're even in an unmitigated way going to emit for the next 100 years tells us we can't wait the problem out. Another point is that regional greenhouse gas emissions are shifting with changes in the world economy. Now, I don't think this pointer will work all the way over there. I don't see it. But if you look at this graph, there's low income, low middle income. These are countries. Upper middle income countries, which would be Chile, high-income countries, or maybe Chile's in high income, I'm not sure. But you notice that there's one important thing that's happened since 1970, and that's the dramatic increase in the emissions from the upper middle-income countries. And the high-income countries have increased emissions as well, but more modestly. And this slide is a little complicated to understand, but what this is 4 pieces of time, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and the noughts. And this is the growth rate in greenhouse gas emissions. That's the height of the bars, the total height. So it was in the area of 6%, and it's been in the area of 10% over the decade since 2000. But the second thing this graph shows is a decomposition of that growth into 4 categories. One is growth in GDP per capita, that's the dark blue. One is the carbon intensity of energy, and you notice that's not changing much at all, that's the red. Another is the energy intensity of GDP, that's the yellow. That's not changing too much either. And then population growth, which is staying roughly constant. What's changed is that people have become much richer, and that's driving up CO2 emissions. And finally, turning to what the real problem is, this is a forecast for the rest of this century of the annual greenhouse gas emissions associated with the top set of lines is doing nothing at all. that's the orange, we'll end up at 4 or 5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. We'll have to cover this roof probably because it'll be too hot in here. Other things will happen. And that's the CO2 level will go from, it was 270 before we started all this, and it'll go to over 1,000 parts per million. 3 degrees, that's the beige, the light beige there is about a 3-degree warming, which is still quite a bit. You know, people talk about 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is the blue. And under both the 3 or the 1.5 degrees, the IPCC says the world will have to go through negative emissions at the end of this century. Now, negative emissions means that we're not just emitting nothing for the world as a whole, but we're actually sucking carbon out of the air. So that just goes to show how difficult the problem is to avoid the orange line with 4 to 5 degrees C increase in average temperature, which is a lot. At the poles, it'll be even more. How difficult it is to get down to 1.5, 2, or 3 degrees. And finally, the costs. These are the costs. The furthest most to the right is the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and it shows the costs as much as 12% of GDP. You can study these a little bit. Even going to 4 or 5 degrees is going to involve some costs. And the other thing to note from this graph is that doing something about the problem will only increase the costs. So that's a brief summary of what the IPCC had to say. Let's see. Where's the light that tells me I'm out of time? Does anybody know where it is? Where is it? In the back? Oh, over there. Okay. Oh, yes, up there. Important to know that. So let me talk about the implications for action, because if you look at the Pope's encyclical, he spends a long time talking about the motivation for action and why it's the right thing to do, but less time. Well, he has quite a bit on action that can be taken, although the specifics are a little short. So let's talk about the implications for action. Now, what I've reproduced here is the goal, 2 goals of the 1994 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Most people don't realize it, but there is a treaty on climate change. It came out of Rio in 1991, and there are 2 main articles in that treaty. Article 1, you can read it yourself, but it says all parties take into account their common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, those are the same words the Pope uses. So there's common ground between the Pope and the treaty that governs the globe. The second article, Article 2, which is a really important article, says the ultimate objective of this convention, that's what treaty is what they mean. The ultimate objective of this treaty is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So what's happened over the last 25 years? People have been debating, what do you mean by dangerous? What is dangerous? Is 3 degrees dangerous? Is 5 degrees dangerous? Is 10 degrees dangerous? Just what is dangerous? But I think the point to remember, though, is this is totally consistent with the papal encyclical. So what does it take to address Article 2, which is the dangerous article? It's not a natural science question, what constitutes dangerous. You know, Venus is a planet that has lots and lots of CO2. It's very hot. As far as physics is concerned, there's nothing wrong with Venus. It's only that if we were to put people there, that there would be something wrong with Venus. So the problem with global warming is not the physical science or even the biological science, it's the fact that people would have a very difficult time existing with their natural environment on a hotter planet. So it's not a question that natural science can answer, it's a social question as to what we want to do about the problem and how much change we can tolerate it. It's partially an economic question. How do different people trade off costs of mitigation, pollution control, with the benefits of avoiding climate change? And secondly, an ethical question. How do people balance gains, losses, rights of others? What right does somebody on an island in the Pacific have to not be flooded? Is that a right that's trumps all others? Or is it a right to be traded off against other things? Both of those are important to determine what is dangerous. Thus, the importance of economics and ethics to the IPCC as well, I would argue, to the Vatican, or at least to the encyclical. Now in ethics, and I'm an economist, here I am talking about ethics. I learned my ethics from two philosophers we had on the chapter, and mostly I'm repeating what they had to say, so this is not just off the top of my head. And the two ways of looking at ethics for climate change are to look at justice and to look at value. It's dividing up the problem. Justice is what is right and what is wrong. For instance, we know thou shalt not kill is one of the 10 Commandments. It's not thou shalt not kill unless there's a good reason. That's not the commandment. The commandment is thou shalt not kill. It's a right that the person you're about to kill has for his life. We have rights that aren't trumped by how much somebody else benefits or loses from your enjoying that right. And what this says for climate change is, what duty does one person owe another, either within generations, which we understand well, but what do we owe the next generation? What do we owe between generations as justice? What is just? And what are people due or entitled to, and what are we obliged to do? On the other hand, value is something where we can compare things, alternatives, and say which gives us more ethical value. And we can weigh alternatives in that way. Social value versus individual value. The Pope makes a very strong case for looking at social value in addition to individual value. How does one define values functionally? So if you're in charge of Santiago and its air pollution plan, how do you make a decision that limiting cars to 16 days a year is the right solution for people versus some alternative they could also consider? How to actually make decisions. It's a more practical matter. And as an example, how one moves from these ethics into practical solutions, this is what the philosophers call prioritarianism, which looks like diminishing marginal utility to economists, but what is on the horizontal axis here is well-being of people. And what is on the vertical axis is the social value of well-being. So if we take one person, myself, and we ask the importance of me to what's happening in the society I live in, what this is saying is that in addition to my well-being, if I were rich, would count less for society than in addition of my well-being to my well-being if I'm poor. The poor count more in helping the poor counts more for society than helping the rich, although both count. So that's similar to diminishing marginal utility, which is within an individual. It says for an individual, as you get richer, extra consumption counts less. This is how individuals contribute to social well-being. And the implications are for time discounting, which is how we trade off future generations versus the present. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because that green light will change to yellow over there, but the Ramsey rule, which was developed about 100 years ago, says that the rate at which we discount the future has to do with our pure rate of time preference, how much we're willing to defer consumption simply because it's now versus later, as well as our measure of inequality aversion, how much we like or dislike inequality in our society. And this is a table that shows different people's opinions of those values and how you get a discount rate to trade off future climate damage with present climate abatement costs. So this is an example of how you can convert an ethical principle into a practical way of making decisions about how much carbon dioxide to reduce now. Another point which I'd like to spend just a minute on is historic responsibility. Many poor countries, really poor countries, claim correctly that most of the emissions have come from Europe and North America, historically, over the last 100 and 200 years. And they argue that there's a historic responsibility, therefore, that those same perpetrators of the problem solve it. And it's not up to the current poor countries to really do anything about it. And if you look for an argument as to what is the correct way to view this, you can go to law, and you can go to law either in the common law, which was from France, or the English common law, the civil law in France, or the Germanic code, and look at how those systems treat pollution and other problems that were not viewed as a problem and only discovered to be a problem later. And I see I'm running down the clock here, so let me just direct you to this, that in fact, for the most part, law decides that only after you realize there's a problem are you held responsible for it. Now you can decide whether that's applicable to climate or not, but that's a historic precedent. Okay, so all this ethics is great fun to talk about, but often you end up talking and talking and talking. The question is how to decide how much to do, who does it, when, where, those sorts of things, and that's where economics can be particularly useful in balancing costs and benefits of mitigation. Now I'm going to move along here because I'm running out of time, but here's a list of some of the big issues in the economics of climate change. And there are 5 of them that I've listed here. One is cost-benefit. Can we use cost-benefit analysis, where you look at the costs of a project, the benefits of a project, to determine proper mitigation? And the answer to that is really no, because it's very difficult to trade off the costs that the poor in Bangladesh will face against the benefits that the rich in the US will face. That's an ethical issue that goes beyond the economics. Uncertainty. Does uncertainty change the way we think about this problem? And that turns out to be extremely important. It matters less what happens to Chile or the US when the temperature changes by 4 degrees. What matters more is the chance that it changes by 10 or 15 degrees. And if there's a 10% probability that the temperature changes by 10 or 15 degrees, then that is where the conversation should be, not the consequences of 4 degrees. Social cost of carbon, that's being heavily used in many parts of the world now to regulate the many sources of emissions we have. You come up with a cost of carbon, you can factor that into unrelated regulations that have emissions associated with them. Co-benefits, are there ancillary benefits associated with carbon mitigation? How to understand those, how to calculate them? And finally, can mitigation have a negative cost? Some people argue that reducing energy consumption actually makes us better off. And the evidence does not support that view, but some evidence does, and it's a big controversy. Okay, I'm going to skip over. I have a slide on each of those points. You can look at them. Let me just close by thanking you. And you can go to my webpage there for a copy of our full report, or if you send me an email, my email will be there. I'd be happy to send you a copy of these slides. Thanks very much.